Konrad, very good morning to you. Over to you.
Good morning, Andrea. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. And a special welcome to our UK and international viewers. So my name is Konrad Shek, and I'm the Director of Policy Research at Credos, the advertising think tank. So Credos produces research and insights about advertising impact on society, culture, and the economy. Credos is committed to an honest appraisal of advertising, identifying its shortcomings as well as positive features, so that the industry can address its findings. Additionally, we are grateful to the members of the Advertising Association and the Front Foot Network who help fund the work that Credos undertakes. So my presentation today is titled, How to Measure Advertising Operations Carbon Emissions. So my presentation will focus on the AdNet Zero journey to measuring advertising operations carbon emissions. So much of this activity stems from the work undertaken by AdNet Zero's Action 1 working group, chaired by James Best. I want to thank him and the working group for their contribution and patience through this exercise. So I will review the background to Action 1, particularly for those who are not familiar with the working group's mission. In Section 2, I will outline how we went about the data collection exercise and some of the challenges that we faced. And in Section 3, I will give a brief overview of the Compare Your Footprint Calculator tool developed by Green Element, which we're using to develop benchmarking insights. And following that, I will outline some of the preliminary analysis of the data so far. And then to conclude, I will discuss some of the key takeaways and lessons learned. As a reminder, the ambition of our AdNet Zero is to get the climate impact of our industry's operations down to real net zero within the next decade. We believe this goal is within our reach by the end of 2030 and can be achieved by a clear series of actions. As outlined on the AdNet Zero report published on November 2020, the total UK agency operations CO2 equivalent emissions from IPA member agencies exceeded 84,000 tonnes a year. From that figure, 42% came from energy usage and 58% from the business travel, with the biggest single contribution coming from flights. The concern about climate change is shared across the advertising sector by individuals and companies alike. And from prior surveys, we have found that around 71% of people working across the industry are worried about the negative impacts of the industry on the environment. More agencies want to take climate action. So Action 1 is essentially about getting our house in order. And by our house, we're referring to those companies whose core business is advertising. And by in order, we mean companies reducing their operational and their people doing the same as employees and individuals. Action 1 is essential to the AdNet Zero carbon reduction plan and to ensure that all AdNet Zero supporters work towards the same long and short-term goals. It's also a requirement for COP26 and initiatives like Race to Zero. Action 1 puts in a framework to allow us to measure operational emissions and track progress towards net zero by 2030. And this will be an annual exercise for AdNet Zero supporters. AdNet Zero supporters who submit data will then have the benefit of seeing their data against an industry-wide benchmark. Benchmarking is also helpful for companies to assess how they're doing within their peer group and to compare against different industries. During the earlier part of the year, AdNet Zero supporters were asked to gather data on their operations covering the period January to December 2020. We decided on 2020 as a starting point, even though this was a pandemic year. Starting from 2019 and then comparing it against 2020 would have artificially inflated progress, particularly as many stopped flying during 2020. We currently have around a third of the expected data. And once we get beyond 50%, we'll be in a position to establish or review our roadmap based on the data collected and set goals within the working group. AdNet Zero supporters are also expected to publicly share their goals for reduction. As many in the sustainable business know, one of the key challenges of addressing climate change is getting accurate data. We found that AdNet Zero supporters had mixed competency in this area. Some were further ahead in this journey, and for some, this was the first time collecting the information in this way. Hence, it was important that the data collection framework was made simple and was able to provide an initial starting point for every supporter. Supporters needed to know where they were on the journey to 1, set challenging targets, and 2, make meaningful emission cuts. This is especially important as each supporter may have different circumstances or different business models. The key data to be collected in this exercise was Scope 1 and 2, as well as some Scope 3 emissions data. This meant collecting data on utility usage, waste generation, and travel. For supporters that had never done this before, this was clearly a challenge, and in some areas data had to be estimated. However, there is a value in doing this as it embeds the discipline of recording information. And because it's an iterative process, the collection and quality of the data will improve over time. Additionally, as more supporters submit their data, over time this data will become more valuable. It means that we can perform further analytics and create bespoke reports. As mentioned earlier, the data collection framework I designed to collect the data was simple and allow for parts of the chain to be easily replaceable. We also set up a partnership with Green Element to use their Compare Your Footprint carbon calculator. So data collected from AdNet Zero supporters would first pass through Credos for data cleansing and to allow us to strip out any data to maintain organizational anonymity before passing to the Compare Your Footprint tool. Even though the concept was simple, in practice it was not so straightforward as there's no set industry format for collecting such data. We needed to agree the data elements to be captured, the data validation rules, and the data transfer mechanism. Moreover, we didn't put any obligation on AdNet Zero supporters to use a specific method or choose a specific carbon auditor. AdNet Zero supporters took a mix of approaches, either hiring carbon auditing consultants or attempted to capture the information themselves. But we were aware that by providing that flexibility, the data capture would be slightly more complex. Each company was likely to use different tools to record emissions data to meet the greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards. We're also aware that some carbon auditors use different data capture tools, such as Excel or web-based forms. In any case, this does present a particular problem for data capture. For each tool, the data columns or metadata may be labeled differently, and the way that data is recorded may be structured differently. So the key goal for the data collection is standardization. Standardization is important as it minimizes the need for additional data manipulation and reduces data quality issues. A lack of standardization means less opportunity for automation and scaling up. So now we come on to the Compare Your Footprint calculator. The Compare Your Footprint calculator is a comprehensive carbon footprint calculator and benchmarking tool. Created by Green Element, a team of sustainability consultants with over 20 years experience of helping organizations worldwide to reduce their carbon footprint. The model has been designed by experienced environmental management consultants who have enjoyed many years of overcoming the challenges of incomplete data sets and have adapted to cope with less than perfect data. So the tool uses Scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions to create a carbon footprint. The calculation methodology applies conversion factors for use by UK and international organizations to report on greenhouse gas emissions. These adhere to the High Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate accounting and reporting standard, ensuring that all data can be confidently used within communications to employees, customers, and shareholders. The data can be compared to other data that Compare Your Footprint has collected to develop the benchmarks. So my next slide briefly discusses some of the preliminary results. From the data that's been submitted by AdNet Zero supporters so far, we've estimated that this represents 7,476.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Again, this covers just a third of the total data submissions we were expecting. So to put this into perspective, this carbon dioxide equivalent emission value is similar to the greenhouse emissions from 1,626 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year, or 18.8 million miles driven by an average passenger car, or the carbon dioxide emissions from consuming 841,000 gallons of petrol. And you'd actually need around 9,160 acres of forest to sequester that amount of carbon dioxide in 1 year, which I think, if I've done my maths correctly, that's over 5,000 football pitches worth of forest. It will come as no surprise that the two culprits of CO2 emissions are business travel, which make up 46%, and electricity, which is 40% of the total emissions. These preliminary results seem to be broadly reflective of the findings of our early AdNet Zero report published in November 2020. If we take a closer look at the emissions generated from business travel, it is clear that most emission-intensive mode of travel is flying, accounting for 93% of business travel emissions. But remember, the data that we've been looking at is 2020, the pandemic year, and we know that flying has been suppressed. So we're expecting 2021 data to show an uptick in business travel now that borders have been opening up. So it'll be interesting to see how that will compare to 2020 data. Quite a few agencies did not provide their fuel mix. So in those cases, we had to make the assumption that the electricity was drawn from the national grid. So this resulted in a 70-30 split between national grid and fully renewable sources of electricity. Clearly, there's a scope for more AdNet Zero supporters to switch to renewable energy backed by renewable energy guarantees for origin certificates. So on to lessons learned. I want to cover 2 operational lessons and 2 procedural lessons. For the 2 operational lessons, clearly we need to look at alternative modes of transport. For example, international rail, video conferencing, rather to return to the flying habits of old. One of the key learnings for the pandemic year is that virtual calls are a viable substitution for face-to-face contact. Admittedly, virtual calls do have their limitations, but if concepts like the metaverse are fully realized, that maybe those limitations may be overcome. But for the time being, it's not a complete substitution. And if air travel is the only option, do consider the options for travel class. Perhaps the boundaries for choosing economy over business or in first can be re-evaluated and extended. And perhaps all short-haul flights, if not already company policy, should be flown economy. As it appears there is a large proportion of AdNet Zero supporters procuring electricity from the national grid, then the next action would to encourage all AdNet Zero supporters to switch electricity suppliers to renewable energy, or those fortunate with space, perhaps on-site solar generation or the installation of heat pumps could be the way to go. I know that initiatives that recycle the heat generated by computer servers to be used in the office heating system. So finally, for the 2 procedural lessons learned, I'd recommend to an AdNet Zero supporter or a future joiner to think about embarking on this journey if they haven't done so already. By engaging this process, you will get a deeper understanding of where operationally you can make emissions savings. And it puts you in a position to ask the right questions to get the data you need. For example, many AdNet Zero supporters struggle to find out how much water or gas they were using, particularly using those who are using shared offices. There was some underreporting with regard to underground train use, as this is because often it was difficult to separate business travel from personal travel. And for companies that operated other businesses, in addition to advertising, it required some thinking about how to apportion things like office use or company cars to billable activities. This suggests that supporters will need to think about implementing systems to allow them to record this information efficiently. It's not impossible to record or collect this information yourself, but you may require the help of a carbon consultant. So if you do, ensure you engage them sooner rather than later. So I hope this presentation was a useful overview of measuring the operational carbon emissions of advertising. I covered the Background to Action 1 working group mission and how there's a collective desire to do more. I also covered the data collection exercise and touched upon some of the challenges in implementing this framework. We are taking early steps in the standardization process, which puts us in good stead to set standards not only in the UK, but internationally too. And by using the Compare Your Footprint tool, we've managed to get some preliminary analysis of the data from what we've received so far. And no surprises, business travel and electricity are the 2 main contributors to operational carbon emissions. But once we've hit around 50% of data submissions, we will establish roadmaps and set goals for reductions. So that concludes my presentation, and I think we've got time for questions.
Konrad, thank you very much. That was great. Can you just tell us what is next for Credos?
So it's basically trying to get more data, so we hit that 50% threshold. And once we've got that data, we can then do further analysis on the benchmarking and then set out plans and procedures, share that data individually with companies so that they can work on their own individual plans on cutting their operational emissions.
Do you feel it's quite a daunting prospect for the advertising industry to take this big step?
It is. It was quite a big challenge to think about and actually setting up this framework initially, because when you think about all the organizations out there and they all have different business models, different ways of working, it's quite a big job trying to standardize this process. At times you have to be a little bit forceful to say, you need data in a certain way. But I think once people get used to that and understand what's required, get into that discipline of actually recording information and recording it accurately, I think we're heading into a good place.
And what would be the consequences if they didn't take action?
Well, I think it then becomes an issue about, how do you actually know whether you're improving? If you don't record and accurately know where you are at the moment in this journey, by making these small fixes, you don't know whether the subsequent years are actually doing better than previous years. So you have to get all the information and the correct data. Data is really, really important in this whole carbon emissions reduction. You have to know what you're emitting to be able to effectively reduce them.
OK, Konrad, thank you very much for joining us. We've really enjoyed your presentation. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.